October 14th, 2019, 11:47 p.m. The Clarksburg Emergency Communications Center was having a quiet night. A fender bender on Route 50, a noise complaint off Milford Street, the usual stuff. Then the phone rang. Dispatcher Renee Holton, 7-year veteran, known for her calm, answered on the second ring. What she heard on the other end of the line was nothing. Not a hang-up, not silence. Something. A presence. Faint breathing. The low hum of what sounded like a television in the background. A creak, maybe a floorboard, maybe a chair. Renee followed protocol. She spoke first. 911, what's your emergency? No response. She tried again. Hello? Are you there? Do you need help? And then, just barely, she heard it. A voice. Female. Young. Barely above a whisper. Please? He doesn't know I called. And then the line went dead. That was it. 4 words. 11 syllables. The entire call lasted 43 seconds. Renee immediately flagged the call as a potential domestic disturbance and cross-referenced the incoming number. It traced back to 4417 Birchwood Lane, a residential address in the Nutter Fort neighborhood just outside the city. Officers were dispatched within 3 minutes. Now, here's where things get interesting. When patrol officers Marcus Webb and Diane Coulter arrived at 4417 Birchwood Lane at approximately 12:03 a.m., everything looked completely normal. Porch light on, car in the driveway, no signs of forced entry, no sounds of disturbance from inside. They knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting on the other side. Standing in the doorway was a man in his mid-40s, tall, calm, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a book in his hand, a Tom Clancy novel, dog-eared at page 312. He was wearing a terry cloth bathrobe. He looked, by all accounts, like a man who had been interrupted mid-chapter. His name was Gerald Whitmore, 46 years old, accountant. Deacon at First Baptist Church of Clarksburg, coached Little League for 11 years. He smiled warmly at the officers and said, and I want you to notice the specific wording here. He said, "Officers, what a surprise. Everything okay out there?" Not, "Is everything okay in here?" Out there. Officer Coulter later noted that in her report. They told him they'd received a distress call from this address. Gerald's face shifted, not to panic or fear, but to what Coulter described as a very practiced look of concern. He invited them in immediately. The house was immaculate. 2 of the 3 kids were asleep, confirmed by a quick visual check. The third, 16-year-old Sadie Whitmore, was supposedly staying at a friend's house. Gerald's wife, Donna Whitmore, 44, a school librarian, appeared from the kitchen in pajamas. She seemed startled but composed. She insisted everything was fine. No arguments, no disturbances. Maybe a neighbor had dialed the wrong number? Gerald offered the officers coffee. They declined. They did a quick walkthrough. Nothing out of place. Officers Webb and Coulter cleared the scene at 12:19 a.m. and filed it as a false call, possible misdial or prank. Case closed, or so they thought. Because 3 days later, dispatcher Renee Holton was eating lunch at her desk and couldn't stop thinking about those 4 words. Please, he doesn't know I called. That wasn't a misdial. That wasn't a prank. Someone at 4417 Birchwood Lane was afraid, and they were afraid of someone in that house. Renee did something that wasn't exactly in her job description. On her lunch break, she pulled the recorded call one more time. She put on her headphones. She turned the volume all the way up, and she listened, not to what was said, but to everything underneath it. The television in the background. She recognized the show. It was a late-night talk show. She could make out the band playing. She checked the broadcast schedule for that night. That particular segment aired at 11:44 p.m. The call came in at 11:47. Someone had been watching television in the living room, while Gerald Whitmore was supposedly alone in his study reading Tom Clancy. Who was in that living room? There's a term that investigators use for phones that shouldn't exist. They call them ghost phones. Prepaid, unregistered, purchased with cash from a gas station or a big box retailer. Impossible to trace to a name. The kind of phone that, when it shows up in a case, sends a very specific message. Somebody was being very careful. The number that called 911 on the night of October 14th traced to exactly one of these phones, a prepaid track phone purchased at a Walmart in Fairmont, West Virginia, 12 miles from Clarksburg, on September 28, 2019, 16 days before the call. Whoever bought that phone had been planning. Renee Holton brought her concerns to her supervisor, a man named Dale Pritchett. She laid out what she'd noticed: the whisper, the phrasing, the television audio, the ghost phone. Dale listened. He nodded, and then he told her, gently but firmly, that they had hundreds of calls coming through every week. The officers had cleared the scene. There was no evidence of a crime. She needed to let it go. Renee went back to her desk. She did not let it go. Instead, she did something quietly remarkable. She typed up a 2-page summary of her concerns, put it in an envelope, and on her way home that evening, she dropped it in the mail to the Harrison County Sheriff's Department. She addressed it to Detective Lori Bazemore, a name she'd seen in the local paper the year before, attached to a domestic violence case Bazemore had cracked wide open after nearly everyone else had given up on it. Renee figured if anyone would read a letter like this, it was her. She was right. Detective Lori Bazemore was 38 years old, 16 years on the force, and had what her colleagues called an allergy to closed cases. She was known for keeping folders of cold files in the trunk of her personal car. Her ex-husband once said she investigated their marriage the way she investigated crime scenes, meticulously and without mercy. She read Renee's letter on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, she had pulled the 911 recording, the dispatch logs, and the incident report from Officers Webb and Coulter. By Friday, she had driven past 4417 Birchwood Lane twice. By the following Monday, she had filed a formal request to conduct a follow-up welfare check, this time specifically asking to speak with each family member individually. Her sergeant approved it reluctantly. The visit was scheduled for the afternoon of October 24th, 10 days after the original call. Bazemore drove out to Birchwood Lane with her partner, Detective Ray Mosley, and rang the bell at 3:15 p.m. Gerald Whitmore answered again. This time there was no book in his hand, no reading glasses. He was in work clothes, dress shirt, slacks. His eyes tracked immediately to the badges on their belts before he even looked at their faces. Bazemore introduced herself and explained she was doing a routine follow-up on the wellness check from 2 weeks prior. Gerald said, "Of course, come in." Again, immediately. Too quickly, Bazemore thought, like a man who had rehearsed this moment. Donna was at the kitchen table, grading papers. She was polite, cooperative. But Bazemore noticed something. She didn't look up from her papers when Gerald entered the room. Not once. The two younger kids, Tyler, 13, and Megan, 11, were doing homework upstairs. Bazemore asked if Sadie was home. Gerald said she was at school, after-school drama club. She'd be back by 6. Bazemore asked if she could wait. Gerald hesitated just a fraction of a second, barely visible, and said, "Of course." She sat in the living room while Mosley made small talk with Gerald in the kitchen. And for 45 minutes, Bazemore did what she did best. She looked at things. The living room was a catalog of a well-maintained middle-class life. Family photos on the wall arranged chronologically. School portraits. A vacation photo from what looked like Myrtle Beach. A shelf full of library books, clearly Donna's. A trophy case with Little League trophies and a few academic plaques. Everything was normal, except for one thing. In a row of family photos on the wall, photos spanning what looked like 15 years, there was a gap, not an empty space, not a bare nail. Someone had moved a photo and replaced it with a different one, but the paint behind it was slightly brighter than the paint around it. A frame had been there a long time. Then it was taken down and replaced recently. Bazemore didn't mention it. She just noted it. At 5:58 p.m., she heard the front door open. Sadie Whitmore walked in and stopped dead in the hallway when she saw the detective. She was 16, dark hair, her mother's eyes. And in those eyes, for just a moment before she composed herself, Bazemore saw something she'd seen 100 times in 100 different rooms. She saw terror. Bazemore smiled gently. She introduced herself. She asked Sadie how school was. Sadie said, "Fine." Her voice was steady. Her face was steady. Her hands were not. They were pressed flat against her thighs, fingers rigid, the body language of someone working extremely hard to appear calm. Bazemore asked if she could talk to Sadie alone for a few minutes. "Just routine," she said, "just checking in." Gerald appeared in the doorway of the kitchen immediately. He said, "Whatever you need to ask Sadie, you can ask in front of us. We're a very open family." And Sadie looked at her father and said nothing. Let's talk about money for a minute. Not because this story is about money, not at its heart, but because money in this case was the thread. The single loose thread that, when you pulled it, unraveled everything. Gerald Whitmore was an accountant. He had worked for the same firm, Caldwell and Associates in Clarksburg, for 18 years. He was trusted. He was precise. He was the man other people called when their numbers didn't add up, which is exactly why it took so long for anyone to notice that his own numbers didn't add up. Let me back up. While Bazemore was navigating the access problem, Gerald's refusal to allow private interviews with family members, the careful choreography she felt every time she was in that house. She did what all good detectives do when they hit a wall. She followed a different path. She requested a standard financial background check on all adult members of the household, something she could justify under the domestic welfare investigation. It was routine paperwork, low-priority stuff that would normally go to a junior analyst. She personally walked it to the Financial Crimes Unit and asked them to rush it. The analyst who ran the check, a 27-year-old named Preston Ware, who had been with the department for 2 years and who was, by all accounts, extremely good at finding things that other people missed, called Bazemore 4 days later. And the first thing he said was, "Detective, I'm looking at something here, and I need to ask, is this account flagged for something else? Because there's a lot of really careful work here. Someone didn't want this found." Here is what Preston found. Gerald Whitmore, on paper, earned approximately $87,000 per year, a solid, respectable income for Clarksburg. His mortgage was paid. He had 2 car payments, modest credit card debt, and a 401k in good standing. Normal, clean, boring. But Preston had done something most analysts wouldn't bother with on a welfare check. He'd gone back further, 12 years further. And what he found, buried in a chain of transactions from 2007 to 2012, was a pattern. Small amounts, never more than $3,000 at a time, moving between 3 different accounts, 2 personal, 1 registered, to an LLC called Whitmore Property Solutions, a company that, technically speaking, existed. It had a state registration. It had a business address. It had filed taxes every year like clockwork. It had never once had a client. That was curious, but not illegal. People form shell companies all the time. What was less explainable was where the money came from. Preston traced the deposits backward. The money had originated from a client escrow account at Caldwell and Associates, the accounting firm where Gerald worked. Let me explain what that means. When certain clients, mostly real estate developers, moved large sums of money through transactions, Caldwell and Associates would hold the funds in a designated escrow account while the paperwork cleared. Gerald Whitmore, as a senior accountant, had authorization to manage several of these accounts. Between 2007 and 2012, approximately $340,000 had been quietly siphoned from 4 different client escrow accounts into Whitmore Property Solutions. $340,000 over 5 years. in increments small enough that no single transaction triggered an audit flag. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't desperation. This was calculated, patient, and very nearly perfect. Bazemore sat with that number for a long time. $340,000. Stolen, hidden, from a man who coached Little League and sang in the church choir. And here was the part that truly unsettled her. The firm had never reported it. She called Preston back and said, "Are you sure? There's no report filed? No internal audit flag? Nothing?" Preston said, "Nothing. It's like nobody noticed." Or he paused. Or somebody made sure nobody would. Bazemore pulled the corporate records for Caldwell and Associates. The founding partner, Douglas Caldwell, had retired in 2013. The current managing partner was Richard Merritt, who had joined the firm in 2009 and been elevated to managing partner in 2014. Bazemore ran Merritt's name. He had no criminal record, no civil suits. But he had something interesting in his financial profile. He owned a vacation home in Hilton Head, South Carolina, purchased in 2013, valued at $740,000 on a managing partner's salary in a small market accounting firm in West Virginia. Bazemore sat back in her chair and she said to Mosley, and this quote is in her case notes, word for word, "Ray, I think Gerald Whitmore has been protecting somebody, and I think that somebody has been very comfortable letting him do it." But here's the question that was still keeping her up at night. What did any of this have to do with a terrified 16-year-old girl and a ghost phone purchased at a Walmart in Fairmont? She was about to find out. Because Sadie Whitmore didn't call 911 because of the money. She called because of what the money was for Hugh. Sadie Whitmore was a sophomore at Liberty High School in Clarksburg. She was in the drama club. That part was true. She was on the honor roll. She had a small group of close friends. By all of her teachers' accounts, she was thoughtful, conscientious, and quiet in a way that made adults want to check on her without quite knowing why. Her school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Elwood, who had been at Liberty High for 22 years, had filed 2 informal welfare notes about Sadie in the previous 18 months. Not reports, not formal referrals, just notes. The kind a good counselor writes when something is nagging at them and they can't quite name it. The note said things like, "Sadie seemed distracted and withdrawn today, asked if everything was okay at home. She said yes, but didn't make eye contact." And noticed Sadie eating lunch alone again, approached her. She was friendly, but seemed relieved when I left. Mrs. Elwood had tried to get Sadie to open up for months. She never could, but she kept watching and waiting. After the October 24th visit to the Whitmore home, after watching Sadie press her hands flat against her thighs and say fine in a voice that meant anything but, Bazemore made a decision. She couldn't interview Sadie at home. Gerald would never allow it. She couldn't compel an interview without more evidence. So she did something smart. She called Liberty High School and asked to speak with the counselor on record for Sadie Whitmore. She and Mrs. Elwood spoke for 45 minutes. By the end of that call, Mrs. Elwood was crying, not because she knew what was happening, because she realized she had known something was happening for over a year and hadn't been able to reach through it. 2 days later, Sadie was called to the counselor's office during third period. Mrs. Elwood told her that a detective had some questions and that Sadie had every right to have an adult she trusted present. She asked Sadie who she wanted. Sadie didn't hesitate. "You," she said. "I want you." The interview took place in a small conference room at the school. Bazemore, Mosley, Mrs. Elwood, and Sadie. Bazemore had done hundreds of these. She knew the protocol. She knew not to rush. She let the silence exist without filling it. For the first 4 minutes of the interview, Sadie said nothing. She looked at her hands. She looked at the table. She looked at Mrs. Elwood. And then she said, "If I tell you something, if I tell you everything, does he go away? Does he actually go away? Because I've seen what happens when people talk, and then nothing changes." Bazemore said, "I can't promise you what happens after, but I can promise you we're going to take every single word seriously, and I can promise you that I don't close cases." Sadie looked at her for a long moment, and she began to talk. What Sadie told Bazemore over the next 2 hours dismantled everything. The $340,000 that Preston had found, the money Gerald had siphoned from client escrow accounts over 5 years, it hadn't disappeared into a vacation home or an investment portfolio. Most of it was gone, spent down over years. But not by Gerald, by Richard Merritt. Here is what Sadie knew, and had known for 2 years since she'd accidentally found a box of documents her father had hidden in the basement behind a water heater. Gerald Whitmore had discovered the embezzlement, not his own, but Merritt's. Back in 2007, Gerald had noticed irregularities in the firm's books. He'd done what he thought was the right thing. He'd gone to Merritt first, privately, to give him a chance to explain. Merritt hadn't explained. Merritt had made Gerald an offer. Stay quiet. Help me clean the paper trail. In exchange, you get a cut, deposited quietly, never discussed, never spent ostentatiously. And Gerald, terrified, trapped with a wife and young kids and a mortgage, had said yes. For 5 years, Gerald had maintained the cover, helped Merritt move money, helped construct the false paper trail through Whitmore Property Solutions. Then in 2012, Merritt had decided the arrangement had gone on long enough. He told Gerald it was over. The accounts were clean, no more transfers. And, crucially, if Gerald ever breathed a word, Merritt would produce documentation showing Gerald as the sole architect of the entire scheme. And Gerald knew Merritt could do it, because Gerald had signed everything, every transfer, every LLC filing, every account authorization. He'd signed it all. Gerald Whitmore had spent the next 7 years living in a house built on a secret, working at a firm run by the man who owned him, raising children in the shadow of a crime he couldn't confess to. And slowly, quietly, he had become someone his daughter was afraid of, not because he'd hurt her, but because she had watched for 2 years since she found that box. What a man looks like when guilt has eaten everything that he used to be. The mood swings, the hypervigilance, the way he watched the front door, the arguments behind closed bedroom doors that would stop the moment any of the kids came near. Sadie hadn't called 911 because she was in physical danger. She'd called because she didn't know what else to do. She'd been carrying this secret alone for 2 years. She was 16. She was exhausted. And she was watching her family collapse in slow motion and couldn't stop it. "I didn't know what to ask for," Sadie told Bazemore. "I just needed someone to come." By November 2019, this had stopped being a local matter. The Harrison County Sheriff's Department handed their findings to the West Virginia State Police Financial Crimes Unit, who within 3 weeks had escalated to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Charleston. Because here's the thing about $340,000 in embezzled escrow funds. When you trace it carefully enough, when you follow the wire transfers across state lines and into holding accounts in South Carolina and Virginia, it stops being a local accounting irregularity. It becomes federal wire fraud. And Richard Merritt, comfortable, careful, living in his Hilton Head vacation home, suddenly found himself at the center of a federal investigation. Merritt's legal team, and it was a team, not a single attorney, moved fast. They filed 3 motions in the first week alone, all aimed at the same thing, discrediting the source of the investigation. Their argument was straightforward and not without some merit. The entire case had originated from an off-the-record tip from a 911 dispatcher, an unofficial letter, a detective who had arguably exceeded her authorized scope during a standard welfare check. They argued the financial records had been obtained improperly. For about 2 weeks in December 2019, it looked like it might work. Then Gerald Whitmore made a decision. I don't know exactly what went through Gerald Whitmore's mind in those weeks. I know what the case record shows. I know what Bazemore later told a journalist in a 2021 interview. She said that on December 19, 2019, she received a call from Gerald Whitmore's personal attorney. He wanted to arrange a meeting. Gerald wanted to cooperate, not for a deal, not for immunity. He just wanted, in his attorney's words, to stop. What followed was a cooperation agreement that prosecutors described as one of the most complete and detailed they had ever received in a financial fraud case. Gerald provided 7 years of documentation, files he had kept carefully in the same box behind the water heater where his daughter had found them. Backups, redundancies, the kind of record-keeping that a good accountant does out of instinct, even when the records implicate him. He had kept everything. Richard Merritt was indicted on 11 counts of federal wire fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of obstruction of justice in February 2020. He was convicted on 9 of the 11 counts in a trial that lasted 3 weeks. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He served his first night of incarceration on March 14, 2021, in a facility 400 miles from his Hilton Head vacation home, which had by then been seized by the government as proceeds of fraud. Gerald Whitmore pled guilty to 2 counts of accessory to wire fraud and 1 count of filing false business documents. His cooperation agreement and the judge's acknowledgement of his eventual transparency resulted in a sentence of 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and mandatory financial counseling. He did not go to prison. Whether you think that's justice, I'll leave to you. Donna Whitmore filed for divorce in April 2020. She and the 3 kids remained in the house on Birchwood Lane. The divorce was finalized in February 2021. Donna told a friend, and this quote made it into a local newspaper feature, that the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. The hardest part, she said, was realizing that the man I'd been trying to protect for years didn't exist. The real Gerald disappeared somewhere in 2007 and left behind someone who just looked like him. Sadie Whitmore testified at Merritt's trial. She was 17 by then. She was on the stand for just under 2 hours. By every account in the trial record, she was composed, precise, and unshakable. During cross-examination, Merritt's lead attorney asked her, "Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you never witnessed any financial transaction directly? That everything you know came from documents you found without permission in your family's home?" Sadie looked at him, and she said, "I found the truth. Whether I was supposed to find it or not doesn't change what it is." Dispatcher Renee Holton was commended by the Harrison County Emergency Services Director in a ceremony in March 2020. The commendation recognized her for going above and beyond in documenting a concern that didn't fit a standard category, and for trusting her instincts when the easy thing would have been to let it go. In her acceptance remarks, she said something that I keep coming back to. "We train for the calls that tell us exactly what they are, but sometimes the most important call is the one that doesn't say anything at all. You just have to be willing to listen to the silence." On October 14, 2019, a 16-year-old girl bought a ghost phone at a Walmart, drove to a parking lot 3 blocks from her house, and called 911 because she didn't know what else to do. She didn't know if anyone would listen. She didn't know if anything would change. She said 4 words and hung up. And one person, a dispatcher on a quiet Tuesday night, heard what wasn't being said, and everything changed. This case sat with me for a long time, not because of the fraud. We see financial crimes every week, but because of Sadie, because she was 16 and scared, and she reached out the only way she knew how, in the only 4 words she had: "Please, he doesn't know I called." There's a lot of cases where the system fails, where the call gets lost and the letter gets ignored and the pattern goes unseen. This time, one dispatcher trusted her gut, one detective refused to close the file, and a 16-year-old girl got to testify and be believed. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, hit subscribe. Because I have 40 more cases just like this one sitting in my research folder. Cases that didn't make the national news, cases that almost slipped through. Drop a comment. Tell me what part of this hit hardest, And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it. You never know what difference it makes. Until next time, stay curious, stay watchful, and always listen to the silence.